senators, and representatives, I have the distinguished honor of presenting.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchins History, where I vividly bring to life one of history's greatest dramas through research, analysis, and artful storytelling. In our gripping new series, The Fall of Europe's Great Empires, we'll journey through an era defined by revolutionary ideals, imperial intrigue, and epic downfalls. From the revolutionary fires of 1848 to the grand ambitions of empire and conquest to the devastating climax of World War I, we'll witness the rise and tragic collapse of Europe's most powerful dynasties, the Habsburgs of Austria-Hungary, the Romanovs of Russia, and the Hohenzollerns of Prussia. Meet key figures who shaped history: Emperor Franz Joseph, burdened by tradition, the enigmatic Empress Elizabeth, and the ill-fated Crown Prince Rudolph, Russia's doomed Tsar Nicholas II, and Alexandra, swept away by the mystical Rasputin, and the ambitious Kaiser Wilhelm II, whose arrogance set Europe on a collision course. Through true historical tales of glamour, betrayal, passion, and political maneuvering, we'll explore how their personal dramas influenced the fate of millions and redrew the map of Europe forever. Join your host, Mr. Hutchins, as we uncover the hidden forces that shape our world, revealing how history's greatest European empires soared to spectacular heights, only to collapse beneath their own weight. Now let's reveal today's episode. Welcome to Mr. Hutchins History, the podcast where we explore the great tides of history that shaped our world. Today, we embark on a brand new series, The Fall of Europe's Great Empires, an exploration into the collapse of three of Europe's most powerful dynasties, the Habsburgs, the Romanovs, and the Hohenzollerns. These ruling houses once commanded vast empires, yet by the end of World War I, all three had crumbled. What happened? How did centuries of dominance unravel in just a few short years? This first episode lays the foundation, tracing the origins of their power and exploring the symbols they chose to represent their might. One of the most enduring, the eagle. Let us begin our journey with the story of how this noble bird became the emblem of conquest, empire, and ultimately downfall. The eagle as a symbol of power. The eagle, with its piercing eyes and formidable wingspan, has long been associated with strength, vision, and domination. Many civilizations have revered it as a symbol of divine rule. The Romans, for instance, made it the standard of their legions. The Achaea, or golden eagle, was carried into battle as a sacred object. Losing it was an unforgivable disgrace, and generals risked everything to recover one lost in combat. One of the most dramatic tales of a lost eagle comes from the mysterious disappearance of Rome's 9th Legion. The 9th Hispanian Legion was one of Rome's most formidable units, having fought from Spain to Britain. But sometime around the early 2nd century AD, it vanished from historical records. According to legend, the Legion marched north from their base in York, heading into the misty Scottish Highlands to subdue the rebellious Caledonian tribes. They were never seen again. Their standard, their sacred eagle, was lost. To the Romans, this was not just a military disaster, it was an existential crisis. It was as if the gods themselves had turned against them. The story has since inspired countless works of fiction, including The Eagle of the Ninth by Rosemary Sutcliffe. Whether the Legion was wiped out in battle or simply reassigned elsewhere remains debated, but the power of the eagle as a symbol of conquest and loss was undeniable. But Rome's eagle did more than mark military formations. It represented the idea of empire, an external rule extending across continents, reinforced by military might, law, and the belief in divine favor. From Augustus to the fall of Constantinople, the eagle stood as guardian of imperial destiny. This notion of divine imperial authority was inherited by the empires that followed. The Byzantine Empire, seeing itself as the true heir of Rome, adopted the double-headed eagle, symbolizing its dominion over both East and West. The Holy Roman Empire of the German nation revived the eagle as a representation of its supposed continuity with ancient Rome, despite its fragmented rule. The Russian Tsars, declaring Moscow the Third Rome after Constantinople's fall in 1453, took up the same double-headed eagle, merging Orthodox Christian legitimacy with imperial ambition. The Habsburgs of Austria, masters of a multi-ethnic empire, saw their eagle as an emblem of dynastic unity, though nationalism would eventually fracture their rule. Lastly, the Prussian Hohenzollerns, known for their militaristic ethos, wielded a black eagle to represent power through discipline and conquest. Historians offer varying interpretation of the eagle's endurance as an imperial symbol. The political historian Benedict Anderson in Imagined Communities suggests that symbols like the eagle helped create the illusion of continuity in otherwise changing political structures. Meanwhile, Edward Gibbon in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire emphasized the irony of these successor states borrowing Rome's imagery while failing to sustain Rome's institutions. Marxist historians such as Eric Hobsbawm argue that the eagle was a tool of imperial ideology, masking the economic and social inequities within these empires. One particularly evocative moment showcasing the power of the eagle occurred in 1804 when Napoleon Bonaparte, eager to link his own rule to Rome, reintroduced the golden eagle as the standard of the French army. It was meant to evoke the disciplined legions of antiquity, yet at Waterloo in 1815, British and Prussian troops captured several of these eagles, an event that signaled the final end of Napoleon's imperial ambitions. Just as the Romans once fought desperately to recover their lost Aquileia, Napoleon's men risked everything to save theirs, proving that, even in defeat, the eagle retained its hold over the hearts of those who marched beneath it. Each of these ruling houses used the eagle to justify their dominance, yet despite their centuries-long reign, they were not immune to the forces of history. The eagle may have symbolized permanence, but history teaches us that no empire, no matter how powerful, can soar forever. The double-headed eagle and the dream of universal empire. The Byzantines were the first to modify Rome's eagle, transforming it into a two-headed creature, one head gazing east, the other west. This symbolized dominion over two worlds, Europe and Asia, and the emperor's role as both a secular and divine ruler. It also underscored the Byzantine Empire's aspirations to be the political and spiritual successor of Rome, reinforcing its claim to be the center of the Christian world.
This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like CastBox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, this imperial dream did not die. Instead, it was adopted by new rising powers. The Habsburgs, with their vast patchwork empire, embraced the double-headed eagle as they sought to rule over many nationalities. This was not just a decorative symbol, it represented the delicate balance of power within the empire, where German, Hungarian, Czech, and various Slavic peoples coexisted under the Habsburg crown. Yet, as historian Peter Judson argues in The Habsburg Empire, A New History, this unity was more fragile than it appeared, as increasing nationalist movements and economic disparities within the empire posed continuous challenges. Meanwhile, the Romanovs of Russia, believing themselves to be heirs of Byzantium, made the double-headed eagle their state emblem, reinforcing the idea of Moscow as the Third Rome. This was not simply a matter of aesthetics. It had real political implications. The Russian Tsars, especially Ivan III and later Peter the Great, used this symbol to justify their territorial expansion and religious authority. The historian Jeffrey Hosking in Russia and the Russians, A History, argues that the adoption of Byzantine symbols allowed the Romanovs to construct a narrative of divine right and continuity, even as their empire grew increasingly unwieldy. One of the most dramatic episodes associated with the double-headed eagle occurred in 1721, when Peter the Great officially declared Russia an empire. During his coronation as emperor, he paraded through St. Petersburg under the enormous banner of the Romanov double-headed eagle. This event, described vividly by historian Lindsay Hughes in Peter the Great, a biography, was intended to send a message. Russia was no longer a feudal backwater. It was an empire, on par with the great powers of Europe. Yet, for all their imperial grandeur, these dynasties struggled with the very thing they symbolized: unity. The same multi-ethnic, sprawling nature that made them great also made them vulnerable. As Benedict Anderson theorized in Imagined Communities, symbols like the eagle helped to foster a sense of shared identity, but they could not erase the realities of ethnic and political divisions. By the early 20th century, these divisions would erupt into revolution and war, bringing these once mighty empires to their knees. The Prussian Eagle, strength through iron and blood. Unlike the double-headed Byzantine eagle, the Hohenzollerns of Prussia kept theirs singular, focused, and black, a bird of conquest and discipline. Where the Habsburgs expanded through marriage, Prussia grew through war, and Otto von Bismarck's unification of Germany in 1871 cemented the eagle's association with militarism. The Prussian eagle symbolized order, control, and efficiency, traits that propelled Germany to become Europe's dominant power by the late 19th century. Prussia's military ethos was encapsulated in the phrase Blut und Eisen, blood and iron, coined by Bismarck himself to emphasize that the unification of Germany would be achieved not through speeches and diplomacy, but through war. One of the most striking moments in Prussian history that demonstrates the power of the eagle as a symbol came in 1871 at the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. Following Prussia's decisive victory in the Franco-Prussian War, King Wilhelm I of Prussia was proclaimed German Emperor. This act, orchestrated by Bismarck, marked the birth of the German Empire. German troops celebrated under banners adorned with the Black Eagle, and the new Reich symbolized the rise of Prussia as the preeminent power in Europe. The historian Christopher Clark in Iron Kingdom, The Rise and Downfall of Prussia, 1600 to 1947, argues that this moment was a masterstroke of political theater designed to humiliate France and cement German dominance. However, Prussian militarism had its costs. The strict hierarchy, rigid obedience, and culture of aggressive expansion created a system that left little room for flexibility. As historian A.J.P. Taylor argues in The Struggle for Mastery in Europe, Prussia's strength became its weakness. Its military-first approach made diplomacy a secondary concern, leading to a series of alliances and rivalries that would spiral into World War I. Furthermore, the symbolic power of the eagle led into the idea of German exceptionalism, which would later be exploited in the early 20th century. The historian Fritz Fischer, in Germany's Aims in the First World War, contends that the militaristic culture of the Prussian elite drove Germany into World War I with expansionist ambitions, believing that the war was an inevitable tool to maintain dominance. By the early 20th century, the Prussian eagle still represented discipline and power, but it also symbolized the dangers of rigid militarism. The same traits that had made Prussia formidable in the 19th century would contribute to its collapse in 1918, as Germany found itself unprepared for the prolonged and attritional warfare of World War I. The empire that had been forged in blood and iron would ultimately dissolve under the weight of its own ambitions. The eagles begin to falter. The three great eagles of Europe, the Habsburgs, the Romanovs, and the Hohenzollerns, soared for centuries. But by the early 20th century, cracks were beginning to show. The rise of nationalism, economic struggles, and social unrest threatened their rule, undermining the very institutions that had once made them powerful. For the Habsburgs, their empire was a delicate balancing act, governing Austrians, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Italians, and South Slavs under one crown was becoming increasingly untenable. The Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867 had granted Hungary equal status within the empire, but the rest of the empire's ethnic groups grew increasingly restless. By the early 20th century, nationalist movements such as the Czech independence movement led by Tomáš Masaryk were gaining momentum. Historian Peter Judson in The Habsburg Empire, A New History, argues that while the empire's bureaucracy was surprisingly effective at managing its diversity, the political structure failed to accommodate growing nationalist aspirations. The Romanovs, having weathered revolutions before, faced an even greater crisis. The failed 1905 Russian Revolution had already shaken the empire, forcing Tsar Nicholas II to grant the creation of a Duma, a parliamentary body. However, as historian Orlando Figes points out in A People's Tragedy, Nicholas's reluctance to embrace constitutional governance only deepened resentment. The rise of socialist and anarchist movements, particularly the Bolsheviks under Vladimir Lenin, threatened the very foundations of the Russian autocracy. Meanwhile, the German Empire, built on Prussian militarism, found itself engaged in a naval arms race with Britain and a complex web of alliances with Austria-Hungary. Germany's foreign policy, driven by Kaiser Wilhelm II's ambitions and aggressive posturing, alienated potential allies. Historian Fritz Fischer, in Germany's Aims in the First World War, argues that German leaders actively pursued policies that made war more likely, believing it to be a necessary path to securing long-term German dominance in Europe. One of the most dramatic moments that foreshadowed the collapse of these empires occurred in 1912 during the Balkan Wars. Austria-Hungary feared the rising power of Serbia, which had gained territory and prestige after its victories against the Ottoman Empire. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914 was not an isolated act of terrorism. It was a culmination of rising nationalist tensions in the Balkans. As historian Christopher Clark details in The Sleepwalkers, How Europe Went to War in 1914, European leaders miscalculated the situation, believing war could be localized. Instead, it escalated into a full-scale global conflict. By 1914, Europe was a tinderbox. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand set off a chain of reaction of events. Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia. Russia mobilized in defense of Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia and France, and Britain entered the war shortly after. The fate of these dynasties were sealed as they embarked on a war that would ultimately lead to their destruction. The Flight Before the Fall. The First World War was not just a military conflict. It was the death knell of the old world order. The war would shatter monarchies, redraw borders, and give birth to new ideologies. But beyond political upheaval, it marked the symbolic downfall of three great eagles, each representative of a different vision of empire, authority, and destiny. The Habsburg eagle, with its two heads facing east and west, embodied a complex and delicate balancing act, an empire held together by diplomacy, tradition, and a fragile notion of unity. For centuries, this double-headed symbol conveyed a grand yet strained attempt to rule over multiple nationalities with different languages, cultures, and ambitions. The empire's perceived purpose was to act as the guardian of Central Europe, yet its ultimate failure lay in its ability to adapt to the rising tide of nationalism. The eagle that had once represented strength and cohesion was ultimately weighed down by the fractures of an empire that could not reconcile its internal divisions. The Romanov eagle, also double-headed, carried a different weight, one of divine right and unyielding autocracy. For centuries, the Russian czars wielded their eagle as a symbol of continuity from Byzantium, a connection that asserted their role as both emperors and protectors of the Orthodox faith. However, by the early 20th century, This perception of sacred authority had eroded. The eagle that once represented the boundless expansion of Russia from Eastern Europe to the Pacific came to symbolize an empire unable to modernize, an empire at odds with its own people. The Romanov eagle, burdened by outdated traditions and an increasingly dissatisfied populace, ultimately crumbled as revolution tore through its wings. The Hohenzollern eagle of Prussia-Germany, stark in its singularity, stood for militaristic discipline, strength, and unyielding control. It was the emblem of a state that prided itself on efficiency, conquest and order, power through Blut und Eisen, blood and iron. Unlike the others, this eagle did not look in multiple directions. It was sharply focused, forward-facing, and determined. Yet, as historians such as Fritz Fischer and A.G.P. Taylor have argued, this singular determination led Germany into a war of ambition, believing in its superiority and inevitability of victory. The very traits that had made Prussia the unifier of Germany, rigid militarism, aggressive expansionism, and an unwavering belief in its own might, would also ensure its ruin in 1918. The Prussian eagle, once soaring at the heart of European dominance, was ultimately brought down by its own inflexibility and overreach. In the end, the imagery of these eagles serves as a fitting metaphor for the fate of these dynasties. The Habsburg eagle, torn between different lands, collapsed under its own contradictions. The Romanov eagle, weighed down by divine right and absolutism, was consumed by revolution. And the Prussian eagle, so confident in its path of war, was struck down by the very forces it unleashed upon the world. Next time, we'll take a closer look at the Habsburgs, their long reign, their struggles with nationalism, and why their empire was doomed even before the first shots of World War I was fired. Thanks for joining me today on Mr. Hutchings History. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with your fellow history enthusiasts. And as always, stay curious, keep questioning, and remember, history is never truly in the past.